If we go to our dynamics, or FX menu, I guess it's called now, then we'll create an end cloth, no option except for the solver. So we still have the ball here, we have the nucleus node, and we have the end cloth node that defines the qualities of this thing, and that's found in the end cloth shape. But if we turn on display shapes here, under ball there's a thing called the output cloth. And we want to attach to that too. We want to attach our hairs to the output cloth. But if we look in the end cloth menu, and I'm just going to tear this off, you can look, there's a hidden input mesh and a current mesh. So the current mesh is the output cloth, or the output mesh, so after the deformations are put on it, that's what renders. But there is actually still an input mesh, which is the original shape of the thing. So you have to be sure you're putting it on the right thing. So let's see if we can make this work. So we'll just put one hair on this. So we'll go to end hair. And we'll create a hair. Press curve, slide the mesh, selected surface. Hair's let me just reset this. Okay, so there we go. Oh, it's a little long. That's all right. So let's just give ourselves some time here. So it leaves the follicle behind, but if we turn off gravity, and then just assign something like a turbulence field to this thing. Okay, so let's see what it does. So you can see the follicle doesn't actually stay on the object. It's staying on probably on the input mesh. So if we go to end cloth display input mesh, I have to select it first. End cloth display input mesh. You can see it's still here in its original location. So that follicle is actually attached to the input mesh, and the current mesh is down here after it's been deformed by that field. So if we go back and display current mesh, then we can see this happening. And if we want to, we can go to Windows, Relationship Editors, Dynamic Relationships, and find that hair, and put that same turbulence on the hair too. Although it's pretty turbulent as it is. Just getting whipped around like that.
How did you turn the turbulence on the hair?
So whenever there's a field in a scene, if you created it with one, like a dynamic node selected, it will automatically be applied to that, but it won't be applied to any other dynamic node in the scene.
Mm-hmm.
So if we go to Windows Relationship Editors, so this is where all the relationship things are, and go to Dynamic Relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So then if we find the hair, in this case it's called hair system 1, we just have to make sure that field is highlighted underneath. If it's highlighted, it means it's active on that object. And so if I go to the end cloth and turn it off here and then play back the animation, then the hair will be affected by it. The end cloth is moving, but I think it's probably because the hair is tugging it.
How do you make it so that the cell would be moving, kind of undulating without the hair being attached to it?
Without the hair being attached to the end cloth?
Yeah, you're saying it's moving just because the hair is pulling on it?
Well, if I turn the turbulence field back on the end cloth, then it will affect the ball too.
instead of
Okay.
using a vernier scope, I just use a water preset.
Mhm.
And played with it and just like,
So what was acting on it to make it move? Do you know? If
I mean,
like was gravity still on?
No.
No.
There was a slight turbulence on it, but like I put the turbulence in the hair system.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, it might be. So let's just turn off this turbulence field. So I just deleted it. So now if we play the animation, nothing should happen, right? Just want to make sure I'm not playing every frame. But, nothing will happen. So let's go into the hair system. And so end cloths don't have their own built-in turbulence. You have to put a field on from outside to make that happen. End hair, you can do a field from outside, but they actually have their own homemade turbulence built in too. So we can go, if we select the hair system, turbulence. So let's just turn this up, see what happens. See if it tugs the end cloth with it. Yeah, so you can see it pulling it along. So that's probably what was happening from yours because it's from all sides. So when you are working with something like an end cloth, I just let it at the default I left it at the default settings. But if we go back and look at the end cloth shape again, we can go. You might. This should be familiar from looking at particles. It's all the same settings with collisions and self collisions and things like that. We're going to look at that a little bit more today. And there are dynamic properties down here about how much it resists stretching, compressing, bending, all this sort of stuff. But you can also change the presets here. So this is in the end cloth shape. If you change the presets, I can change it to something like concrete. Obviously, that will have very high resistance to stretching. So now the hair won't be able to do much to it. It is making the whole thing move a little bit because there's no gravity. It's just floating in space, really. So you can go to, so you can do something like a water volume, and this will be much more likely to deform. So you can get something like that. So that's probably what yours was doing.
Yeah.
So you can change all this stuff here. And now, Irina, you were doing you were using end cloth on your plane, right?
Yeah.
Another thing you can do with end cloths, if you get. So does this? Before I go on to that, does that kind of answer your question?
I have like one more question.
Sure. Yeah.
So I could apply geometry to the hair by like going into the paintFX
Yeah.
and saying like draw as mesh or whatever. But I never really got it to like look like it was actually like an extruded face.
Yeah. So paintFX, you're not going to be able to. You can fake that because it is a separate piece of geometry. So you could do that in a couple of ways. If we just go in here and so there's the paintFX shape here. I don't want all these hairs. So I would probably do it so there wasn't any. I would probably attach my own paintFX to this, maybe. How would I do this? Okay, let's just do it with this one here. But if we select our paintFX here, yes, it's different. When you do it this way, the paintFX settings are actually in the hair, right?
Yeah, so click draw as mesh under.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's right. And then play around with it in the hair system shape.
Okay, actually, so let's step back and just look at paintFX generally before we jump into all this stuff. And then I'll come back to the other end cloth thing. Okay, so I'm just going to create a new scene. And let's just look at how paintFX work, and this might answer the question. So you may have your paintFX shelf open already or available. If you don't, you can usually find it in here in the shelves under paintFX. And if it's not loaded, just like anything else, you can go to Settings, Preferences, to the Plugin Manager, and you can find paintFX. But paintFX should always load. Do you guys have paintFX?
Yep.
I heard some yeses, nos. Okay, so if there's no shelf, you can always go to Modeling, to Generate, and then all the paintFX options are in there. There's an unrolled up cup here. What if it's a car? It's on my desk, right? No, it's nothing. I didn't win. Do you guys see paintFX under the Generate menu? Yeah, in the modeling menu set under Generate. It's easier if you have the shelf, just because you can get a visual representation of these things. So in the shelf bar up here, there's these lines. You should be able to load shelves. And if you don't see that, it should be in the plugin manager, I think.
Which one? There's two. If you load a shelf, there's the paintFX.mel or paintFX.res.mel.
There's the paintFX, yeah. Yeah, I saw that .res a while ago. I don't know what it is actually. So let me just create a couple of things and show you what we're dealing with here. So paintFX is a procedural modeler that allows you to generate lots of things and change their qualities. So you can do things like cover a field with grass, or cover the inside of something with cilia. So you can do different things. And it has certain dynamic qualities, but it's not connected to end cloth in any way. It's not in the nucleus world, so it can't interact with that stuff. In the case Sam's talking about, you can apply a paint effect to a curve that is dynamic, and then you can render that paint effect, but the paint effect itself is not dynamic. So I'm just going to create a plane to paint on. And in the shelf here, you can select something and make it paintable. So that's what this icon is, the paintbrush with the 3 spheres. And that's probably under Generate, Make Paintable here. We don't have that. So I'm just going to delete the history on this thing first. And then make it paintable. And then you can select a brush. So I have some brushes here in the shelf. If you don't have the shelf, you can go to Generate and Get Brush, and it will open up the visor with a whole bunch of options for you. And there are lots of different things, and you can see presets. So you can see that it can generate strange, kind of useless things, but some things that we can turn into kind of handy things for rendering out background items if you need to fill up a scene with things. Hamburgers. There's one called DNA. Don't get excited. It's not good. So a paint effect is made out of 3 things, generally speaking. A stroke, so the curve that you draw in the scene that the paint effects grow along or out of. There's the paint effect brush, which defines the quality of the paint effect that grows out of that stroke. And then there are tubes. Tubes only come into effect if you have an item growing out of the stroke. So let's do the simplest kind where you don't have tubes and it's just a stroke with a brush. So I'll select this kind of neon looking thing here. Let's turn off my grid. And then if I just draw on the scene, it draws what looks like geometry into the scene, and I can render this. So with the Maya software renderer, it puts, so this green thing we see here is the brush. And if we go into form mode, in the middle of it, there's a curve going down here, and that's the stroke. So if we look at the attribute editor, got the transform for the stroke like anything else, and then we've got this stroke shape node. And you can change certain things like how high quality it is. So if I start reducing this, it turns down the, they're not polygons, but they're called segments, the number of segments here. You can turn off draw as mesh, and this is how it shows up in the scene. Sample density is how many segments there will be along the length, so give it more or less curvature. Things like that. This end bounds is kind of useful. You can animate this if you want to make this thing growing. So you can see you can set keys on something like the max and min clip. You want to have this structure growing into your scene. There are a few other things in here, like pressure mappings. So you can change the scale over the length. Oh no, that's not our one. Pressure map is going to be on, yeah, scale. So you can make it thinner and thicker in different parts by adding points to this ramp here, or this graph. So you can see how it's changing the thickness here relative to the thickness over here. So you can sort of control the quality of this. This is not, it looks like a tube, but this technically is not a tube. This is the brush, just the brush. So you can change that stuff, and you can still, animate this kind of thing. So this is why it's considered a procedural thing, because you don't delete this history, you preserve this stuff, and you can change the nature of this and animate it if you want to over time. So we got the stroke, transform, stroke shape, and then the brush. And this one's called neon blue. And this is where all this stuff happens. So if we look in here, under brush profile, this is how you can change how thick the tube is. So the brush profile will change that. Softness has to do with how it renders. Flatness has to do with how flat it is. So you can flatten it this way. And then you've got stamp density again, but you can see when I'm changing this, nothing is changing on the actual object. This is the stamp density for when it renders. If I do this really low and do a render, you can see the individual stamps. So this is paintFX when you render it this way. This is with the Maya software renderer. It's called a post-process. So it renders all the polygons in your scene first, and then it paints these on top of your render. That's why it's called a paint effect. So this is also why it doesn't really work as sort of the star of the show unless you convert it to polygons, because when you get up close to it, even if I turn the segments, or no, that's the wrong thing. If you turn the stamp density up, the quality is better, but if you get up close to it, then you can still see it kind of not being great. Okay, but let's carry on and look at this a little bit more. Things like twist. Let's not worry about that right now. If you render this as mesh, then you can control the tube sections. Again, this isn't tube, so we'll look at this in a minute. And then there's shading here, so you can change the built-in shader here, so you're not putting your own shader on it. It's got a color, an incandescence, and a transparency. So if I change this incandescence to a green color, And we can see it changes color here. You've got sort of an ability to put textures on this, so 2D textures that can be applied along this as if it were a surface, but it's not as powerful as building your own shader network. You can do map colors and things like that on it. Generally speaking, this isn't how I would use this anyway, so I'm not going to talk about this too much. Illumination, you can turn on illuminated and have this thing react to real lights if you want to, but again, ultimately I always turn these into polygons because I want to render with mental ray, and you can't render paintFX with mental ray until you convert them to polygons. So a lot of the time I just ignore this stuff. So this is a really good way to render out strokes. Like if you have white matter tracks or something like that, and you had curves for those, then you wanted to apply a paintFX to them to render them out as glowing lines inside a brain or something like that. paintFX are quite useful for that in this simplest form. So if you're working on something and you make changes to paintFX and you want to save it, you can save a brush preset. So I started with this neon blue brush, but I've made changes to it. And if I've got it the way I like, you can go into the paintFX menu and do Save Brush Preset way down here at the very bottom. And then you can change its name and save it to your shelf up here, whatever shelf you have open. So you can see I've got a whole bunch of custom ones I've made for microvilli and things like that. So you can save that there. And then you can launch it again and use it later. So if I wanted to render this with mental ray, then you can select the paint effect itself and go to modify. So whenever you convert something, remember converting particles to polygons or NURBS to polygons, it's only the modify convert menu set. But here we want to go to paintFX to polygons. And it gave me a warning down there. There are no lights. Now if we look here, we have, just look in the outliner. So now we've got this thing called the neon blue mesh group. So this is our converted polygon shape. So now if we try to render this with mental ray, it will render it. It's strange. It must have some weird shader on it. But if we just back out a little bit, so it's just got a really bright glow on it. So if I just look in the hypershade, you should be able to see. I just had to trash all my preferences, so everything is different now. Yeah, so it's created this new material. It's a neon blue shader, and this is, what kind of material is this? It's probably a Fong or something. Yeah, it's a Fong. So these are the old Maya shaders, so Fong and Blinn, Lambert, things like that. And so it's got a bright incandescence that's overwhelming everything. So if I just turn this down, it's got transparency almost all the way up. So turn that down, and this is just the base color. So you can see it looks like it's still glowing. It is still glowing. It doesn't just look like it is. But in addition to things like incandescence in these old shaders, I say this like they're bad shaders. They're not. They're useful shaders, but the future workflow for mental ray seems to be the Mila shader, which is why we've been emphasizing it. And by we, I mean me. Under special effects here, there's a glow intensity in these old shaders, so you can just turn that on or off. Generally speaking, I would just do that in After Effects because it works the same. Glow in Maya works the same as glow in After Effects. It's painted on after the rendering process. So now this is renderable in Mentor. So that's good. Just have to convert it to polygons. So let's look at what else paintFX can do. So this is the most, in some ways, the most useful part of Mental Ray because it just allows you, of paintFX, it allows you to render out curves because you can't do that otherwise without extruding a mesh along them. So if we go back into the paintFX options here, if we select a different brush that looks like a plant, let's say I'll take these daisies here, and if I paint, you can see that now there's not a brush going along the stroke anymore, but tubes growing up out of the stroke. And so these are called tubes in paintFX. So if it's going along the stroke, they're not tubes. If they're growing out the stroke, they are tubes. And the only reason that's important is because when you look in the menus for how to change these things, all the settings for these things that grow out of the stroke are under the tubes menu. So right now tubes is turned on. If I turn that off, you can see it gets rid of the tubes and all the settings go back into making just this rendering along the stroke. So I turn that back on. And let's just look at these for a second. So under tubes, we've got creation. So this is first setting how many tubes grow along here, the stroke. So if you need to fill it up with more things, you can change that here. If you need it to be wider, just like before, under brush profile, we can change the brush width. You can see that they spread out from around the stroke more or less. So you can have them tighter or looser to the stroke. So tubes per step, tubes random, just makes them random. Segments has to do with how refined this sort of what looks like geometry is. So I can turn this up. You can see the more segments are growing, but it's also changing the quality of these little daisies that grow here. So if we just do a quick render so you can see what we're dealing with here, we have to go back into Maya software renderer because we can't render with Mental Ray yet. And you see how fast that renders because it's not really treating them like 3D objects, it's just painting them on the scene afterwards. And so you can see that they're sort of 3D looking, but they're not really reacting to lights in the same way as real objects, but they can be useful for filling up a scene with things.
Mark, why would you use paintFX over XGen?
Well, XGen is much more recent, so XGen is kind of an improvement on paintFX. What paintFX does that XGen doesn't is that it's procedural. So with XGen is 2, except when you load in the archives, say I modeled this daisy and you set it as an archive object in another file format, then you import it into XGen and it distributes that over the scene. So you can't change like the branching quality of that daisy anymore. But you can procedurally change the height of different ones, the width of them, the rotation of them with XGen, and we can look at that maybe next week a little bit. But XGen is better it's a pain in the ass to get working properly. But if you're just using it to distribute objects in a scene, or for making hair or fur, it's actually very powerful. But it doesn't have this procedural nature. So, and paintFX can also have built-in animation that you don't have to write with expressions. XGen doesn't really. And so if you made hair with XGen and you wanted to animate it, you'd have to animate it with dynamic guide curves, for example. So you would put some dynamic hairs in there and they would follow that. with paintFX, there's some stuff built in. In some ways, paintFX is a bit of a dead-end technology in Maya. They keep it because it's useful for some things, but they haven't really developed it much in the past few years. That said, I still do use it occasionally for things. But XGen is new to me too. I've used it in one project for making fur. And I've been looking at it lately for putting archive objects in a scene. But still haven't figured out how to animate them if they have to be animated. So if we just look at this, so here's more of the procedural part here. If I just go into 5 mode, we can see these. I'm going to copy this tab and so I can deselect. So we can see what's going on here. So if we go back into tubes, creation. So there's a length min and length max, so you can vary the population here. So you can have some of them be very short, some of them be very tall. So it's useful for this sort of thing if I want to make these random items in our scene. Whenever you see something that has width 1 and width 2, or number 1 and number 2, that means at the base and then at the tip. So if we change the width at the tip here, so you can see them thickening up at the tip, and if we reverse that, we can make them thicker at the base, down here with width 1. And width bias just has to do with the blending between 1 and 2. So right now it's right in the middle. And you can do other things like width scale, just like we saw before, so make them thin in the middle, thick on both ends, that kind of stuff. And so this, the tube direction, they're growing along the normal, so a curve has a normal that points out of it. And so you can have them along the path too, if you want them kind of growing like this, so lying down along the path. And then you've got elevation and azimuth, and this has to do with how they twist and rotate. So the whole metaphor for paintFX is plant growth, even though you can use it for making lots of different things. And it has branches, and from the branches can grow twigs, and from branches and twigs you can have leaves, and on the ends of twigs and branches you can have flowers and then buds. So if I turn off buds here, you'll see that part of the flower disappears. Let's just get in close to one of these. You can see it's having a hard time drawing this on screen. It doesn't know whether this is in the back or the front. But if I turn buds back on, you can see it's growing that out. Turn flowers off, those are gone. Leaves, obviously, are the leaves there. We don't have twigs. If I turn these on, they're like secondary branches. And then if I turn off branches, we just have the original stem. And so we don't have to go through all of these things, but you can imagine you can change all of these settings. How many branches do we start with? So if we go to 3, then we'll have a tri-branching thing from the base. The number of branches. Split maximum is like how many times it splits along its length to trifurcate or bifurcate, all this kind of stuff. So you can change all of these things. And so let's look at another example where these things are used to make something totally different. So I'll just delete these and I'll choose my teapot. So this is also made with the plant metaphor of paintFX. And it grows these teapots, right? So if we look in here at the teapot brush, and these are tubes per step, we saw this step, and then we've got a width scale. So this is the actual first stem, and you can see somebody drew this width scale that looks like the profile of the paintFX. So you can see the lid here in this little corner here. We just turn this on. So you can see the shape there, right? Then if we look at growth, it's got leaves and flowers. So we turn off flowers. Flower is the handle. Leaves are the spout. I get all steamed up. So if we look at the leaves here, we can see the leaves in cluster is 1, so we turn this up. Now we've got numerous spouts here. So if we have more than one, then we can do this. And then to make that shape, it's just a width scale profile that somebody drew. And then it's got curl, so you change all these sorts of things. So you can change the quality of the leaves, and then the flowers for the handle. So you can increase those things to make a different shape. Now again, these can be rendered in the Maya software renderer, which we don't really use much anymore. And these shouldn't be renderable in Mental Ray. No. But you can convert them to polygons. So if I select these and just like before modify, convert paintFX to polygons. Oops. To select them first. Now you can see it's broken them up into separate shapes. So the handles and the spouts and the bodies are separate. Okay. Now we can render these Mental Ray. Okay. So let's look at a sort of scenario where we might want to make kind of waving grass that looks like, microvilli or something like that. Let me just select all this junk and get rid of it. So we still have our polyplane here. And so if we select a preset brush, I'll open up the brush visor here. You can look at something like grass or underwater and just find something like the sea anemone or kelp, tube weeds, something like that. So I don't know, let's try tube weeds. And I can just paint them on here, and I can paint a few strokes to get them looking the way that I want. And if we play the animation, I don't know if these ones have animation already. Yeah, so you can see they're just swaying slightly. So it's just a cheap and easy way to get something like this in your scene. Now if we want to make changes to this, we can go in and select one of these, and you can see they're all separated. And if I look in the outliner, we've got stroke tube weeds 1, 2, 3, and 4. So these are the brushes. So there's tube weeds 4, and if I make changes to tube weeds 4, it's only going to affect this one, which is not really what I want. I want them all to be affected at the same time. So the easiest thing to do is to select all of them with Shift and use a command in paintFX saying, and it says share one brush. So now, whatever the last brush was that I selected, which was tube weeds 2 here, if I make changes here, it changes all of them. Okay? And so I can go in and make a few changes here. So maybe I want these to be a little bit fatter. You can see they're kind of twisty, right? So there must be some sort of twist setting going on in here. So we can look through the settings here. There's no growth other than the initial stems. If I turned on branches, then we could get more of these. If I turned on leaves, then there's some sort of preset leaf in there. Twigs, But let's find out where that twist is, because I don't like that twist.
Mark, sorry, where did you find the tube weeds in the grass?
Underwater.
Water.
Underwater, yeah. No, sorry. Underwater.
Oh.
Yeah, not underwater, but underwater.
Gotcha.
Good.
Underwater, yeah.
Yeah. Underwater. So below the growth, we've also got a behavior setting down here. And this is where, first of all, we can see where turbulence is. So right now, grass wind is turned on. So this is not turbulence in the sense of an external field. This is a built-in one, not related to encloth or anything like that. So I can turn up turbulence to change this. But you can see you get nice animation pretty easily out of the box for something like this. So grass wind just means the whole stem moves. If you do something like tree wind, you can imagine the trunk is not going to move as much as the branches and twigs. So the type of animation you'll get is different, although it looks exactly the same. But if we had branches and twigs, it would be different there. Let's go back to grass wind. So that's under behavior. You've got displacement, and that displacement means just changing the quality of the mesh that's generated from this. So we can see if there's anything in here. There's no noise, there's no wiggle, there's no curl. So that's not what's doing this. Twisting, so where is the twisting? Actually, I have no idea what the twisting is, so we're going to figure it out. Under forces, we can make it follow the path, so bend down to the path, and this can be animated if you want to have them swaying this way too. You can put an expression in this to change over time. Curve follow, we're not going to get into this, but you could put a dynamic curve in here, just a single hair that's growing up here, and then if you set it as I forget what it's called, a control curve in paintFX, then if you turn curve follow up, it's going to follow any control curve you have in there. So if you have one hair that's wiggling around or a bunch of hairs that are wiggling around, you can use those to drive the movement of this. And then you can, in that way, tie them to encloth and fields that affect things in the nucleus world.
So would that be useful for like an undulating bacteria with cilia on it?
Yep, so you could do something like that. So if you, we can try and build something like that in a minute. We'll put a paintFX on it. It'll be related to the thing that you're doing.
I didn't have like all of that. It's like custom.
Yeah, so when you build the hair, it's got a paintFX brush on it. But you don't have all this control over it. It's sort of a limited set. But you can just have a hair that's only a curve, and then just apply one of these things to it if you want to. But remember, when it's on a hair, it's not a tube that's growing out of a stroke. It's just that painting along the stroke that we saw first when it was glowing, remember?
I saw like I was watching like a new release of Maya thing, and what's that guy's name that works in journal?
Duncan Brinsmead?
Yeah. He made like a koosh ball, and I wish there was a tutorial online for it. It was,
Did you look in his area?
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, it didn't
no.
have.
he didn't have that?
No. But it looked like.
Was it with paintFX? Or was it with hair?
I feel like it was a. I should go back and watch the video. But he was just like going through things really, really quickly. But it.
What? Yeah, maybe this afternoon, if you show me
Yeah.
that, we can figure out what he did.
Like the geometry was part of the. and
Like it was actually all
applied-
connected?
Yeah. It would be applied to like a bacteria or something like that, where
Yeah.
it looks like it's all part of the same skin.
Okay, I'll have to look at that. I don't know if that would have been done with paintFX or not. So we've got spiral. That's not it. Bend? No. Occupation surface. I haven't done this before, but if you occupy attraction is a way to make these things grow up along a surface. So if you have a wall or a plane and then these plants, you can turn occupy attraction on and they'll grow up it. Or you can have them grow along the inside of a sphere. He's Duncan Brinsmead as an example where he shows it trying to show vessels growing up along a surface of something. So it's an approximation. You don't have that much control to make it really look like vessels, but you can make it follow a piece of geometry.
Twist is up near the top.
All right. So under damn you, twist. But there's no twist in here. Mesh? It's in here somewhere.
When I change the twist rate, that's what.
Oh yeah, there you go. Twist. Named appropriately. So you can put end caps on here if you want, so it just closes them up. That's also under these mesh settings. So one of the tricky things with this, when you convert this to a polygon mesh, so convert to polygons. So they're converted and they have very hard edges here. But you can smooth these. So if I just, you can see they're all separated now, but if I select these and hit 3 on the keyboard, it will smooth them so you can kind of get rounded edges like this. But if you've got a really dense mass of these things, then that can really slow down the computer. But you could have a bunch of the ones in the front that look the way you want them to look, and the ones trailing off into the background can be less detailed. But now that they're polygons, we can put any type of material we want on them. So if I just apply a new material.
Do they retain the animation?
They do. So because they're procedural and we haven't deleted their history, 3. Yeah, see, it's already asking, it's telling me that this would make a large number, so I'm just going to say no. I just hit 3 on the keyboard to smooth them, although that doesn't seem like that many. But now if we go back and play, it's slower now because it's 2 stages of construction history. It's doing the animation on the paintFX and transferring it to the vertices on the polygons. But yeah, you can definitely do that. So if we look at these things, if we just made one of these, I think if we look in the UV text editor, they actually have very clean UVs because they're just tubes that grow out. So if you wanted to put a material on these, material on these that you wanted to have fade out where they intersect with the object so they don't look so harsh, you could do a transparency mask on here, so using a ramp or something like that because the UVs are laid out nicely. And so if I got these in the way that I wanted them, I could select the original brush and save these as a preset on my shelf here and give it a different name. So you can, if I just delete these, and if I go into some of my presets here, I've got a whole bunch, I don't even know what they are anymore. So, you know, I just made something like this to have a field of these probably slightly swaying things just to fill up the background of a scene. And so there's no effort into generating these things really, especially if you're going to render them out as a background pass. If they're going to be blurred or out of the light slightly, it's kind of an easy way to do it. So the brushes aren't by default converted to polygons, so I still have to always do that in preparation for rendering if I want to use mental ray. But they should still, yeah, so they still maintain their animation and are renderable. But you see, they don't look like they're attached to the surface in any way. Right? So ways you can do that. If there are loads of them, you don't really see the bases. Like if you had the whole surface covered with them, you wouldn't see the bases. But you can also make the colors match between the two, and you could put a transparency ramp on here. So if I selected these, that's my render. If I selected these, they are selected, and go into my hypershade. So here's my new shader that was created for these. And they've got a ramp built into the color. That's why they go dark at the bottom and brighter red up to the top. But if I create a new ramp, just a texture ramp because the UVs are laid out, I can attach this to the transparency of this shader. Oh, there it is. So out alpha to, or out color to transparency. Oops, sorry, I'm just trying to get my there it is. So this would be 0 transparency. This would be 100% transparency. So I want them mostly to be opaque. So I want them mostly to be black. And I want them to be the reverse. I want the white to be down at the bottom. So they're, oops, transparent. Oops. Erg. So if we render these, so you can see that we're making them more transparent at the bottom, but the specularity is kind of wrecking the transparency down there. There's still specular down there, so we can fix that by putting in a reverse node. So if we take the out color from that same ramp, go into the reverse node, and then take the output of that reverse node and put it into the specular color. Then it's where it was black, it's white, where it's white, it's black. And then we should just get them look like they're fading into the surface, like that. So that's one way you can hide the transition between a piece of geometry and something like that. So I would advise that paintFX can be useful when you want to do a fairly limited area covered with something like this. I've tried to do it myself, and I've seen people do it trying to line sort of the inside of a lumen of an intestine or something with the sort of fibrous kind of microvilli and villi. But it really kind of cacks out if you try and do too much of that with it. But I've had good success when it's a scene sort of like this, where you're seeing a fairly limited number of them, but using them to fill up the background with things like this. Okay. So any questions about that? Do you want to try it a little bit? Yeah.
If you wanted faster render times, can you just render it in the animation IS software and then just pause it?
Yeah, for sure. So that's a good point. So let's say these were just the background elements. You could render them all in Maya and just bring them into After Effects, especially if they were going to be blurred slightly or something, or if you put some motion blur on them in the background. Yeah, because then it would render much faster because it's just painted on.
But then you wouldn't be able to apply them to the material, right?
No, no. So you can't apply any of that kind of stuff. So you're really limited in how they're going to look. But if it's just sort of the feeling of motion in a 3D space, because if your camera's moving but not pushing into the scene, let's say it's just coming down, and you want to get that feel, parallax with a field of these things in the background, then you could still do that with the Maya software renderer for sure. Just trying to think if there's anything else to say about this. There are other things. Really, it's one of those things that you just kind of have to play around with when a project comes up. But there are different types of brushes in here. So if I go to the visor again, you'll notice there are plants and plant meshes. So these just are generated, and the teapot was a mesh. The plants and the daisies were not meshes, but you can convert them to meshes. I shouldn't say you convert them, you draw them as meshes on screen, and they just render a little bit differently. These ones, with these clocks on them, they indicate that they grow, but they don't really grow very well. But you can animate. Oh, actually, let me just show you this one last thing. If we take something like the fun mesh. So oops, that's too big. So you can use these also to kind of fill up, if you want to have sort of a fibrous background. Something like this fun mesh, is a good way to do it, because you can just easily draw these things if you need to have a background that's just seems like it's filled with fibrous material, and convert these to polygons and then render them out, because they're not smooth enough to render at this stage. But the last thing I wanted to show you was down here under tubes, there's a thing called gaps. So you can have, it's not going to show up on screen very well here, but something like this brush here, where it's I render this out. Maybe you'll see nothing. It can make the gaps between these things and make it look like discontinuous little beads on a string. This is like a pill preset. But beneath that, let me select. One of these ones. There's flow animation here. So you can actually animate the growth of a tree. So the stem will start to grow, and then it will branch, and then the secondary branch, tertiary branches, and the twigs and flowers will grow using stroke time and time clip here. So you can see this one in the foreground, how we keyframe this, it's going to grow from that base. Let me just actually set some keys on here. I'm going to delete that other jump. Oh, of course, this one's not working. Oh, there it goes. So this was, again, another procedural thing that would be, there it goes, that would be kind of difficult to do in any other way. Other programs like Houdini do this very well, because all their models are procedurally generated, but in Maya there isn't much that can do this sort of thing. So it's got limited uses, but it can come in handy sometimes.
Mark, is that just the crack
That's the cracks brush, yeah. And there's this one, there's the tree mesh, and these are kind of just bizarre alien looking things. There are other things, just like this one called, there's one different type of brush in here. This one's called Pine Forest. Anything that says forest, if we paint this in the scene, you can see it actually generates a whole bunch of cards. And these just have images of those pine trees on them. And you can put any image you want on those, and they actually can sway and move too. So that's another cheap way to fill up a scene with background images. You just have to load in a different texture. Any other questions about paintFX? Okay, well, why don't we just take a quick break, and then I'll come back to the hair on the surface. Now we've talked all about paintFX, and we can look at that a little bit more. Then we can get to the expression writing stuff after that. Okay.